In writing, if you're going to try and publish, you have to look at like a lot of different magazines, right? If you're writing short fiction. I would say the majority will say things like, these topics are not going to appear in our magazine. And one of the most common ones you'll see is violence against children. So when you're writing a story like this, you actually are closing yourself off to a lot of potential publication avenues. Now, I totally get why magazines do this. Hey everybody, just wanted to give you a quick content warning for discussions of violence against children and physical abuse that's going to be in this episode, so just be aware. Welcome, friends, to episode 235 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Joe Hill's 2004 short story and Scott Derrickson's 2022 film of the same name, The Black Phone. All right, hold on a second, James. I think I'm getting a call. I'm hearing a ringing somewhere. Do you hear that?
Yeah. My cell phone seems to be breathing or something.
It's breathing, yeah. That was creepy.
It was creepy.
I like that was a detail from the story that made it into the movie. We're getting ahead of ourselves. So we are talking about Joe Hill and Scott Derrickson this week, which should be a lot of fun. You know, these are both pretty big names, I think, in our respective industries. Joe Hill, we're going to mention a few times, is the son of Stephen King. We'll try and keep it to a minimum, but it is, I think, pertinent for to understanding his career and, you know, where he sits in the industry and how people think of him. You know, we read the short story. Oh, I read the short story before I saw the movie. Did you do the same, or did you do it the other way around?
I did it the other way, actually.
You did? Okay. So that's actually kind of interesting. Maybe we could talk about the different way that affects us, because the short story is very similar to the movie, but the movie is much more expanded, right? I mean, the short story is only 30 pages, pretty short. It's like 7,000 words. And the movie obviously adds a lot to that. But it kind of follows a similar route, and it does sort of spoil the movie, the ending of the movie, because it's very similar. So you saw the movie without having read it, so maybe you were a little more surprised by what was going on, whereas I kind of knew a lot of it was going to play out a certain way. We're going to focus, I think, first on the short story, just because that's what we typically do.
It's really interesting to see Stephen King's son lean into an area that very much is inspired and like would fit alongside Stephen King's work, because I feel like typically artists like to have their own, like, sort of feel like they need to get out of that shadow. And maybe, I don't know Joe Hill's history, so maybe he started and maybe he didn't start with horror and he found his way into it, but I liked it a lot. And I think there are like the sort of fingerprints of Stephen King on it, not necessarily, I think, as any other horror author would have the fingerprints of Stephen King. I don't think that it's clear from his writing that that's his father or anything like that. But yeah, a lot of fun to read this story and be thinking about that. Interesting because it is kind of serial killer kidnapping story with elements of pretty massive supernatural elements.
Well, I think there's some ambiguity there, especially in the short story. I think a lot of the supernatural elements are played up a little more in the film. It's not quite as ambiguous. In the short story, you could read it almost as like a metaphor or something that the kid is hallucinating. There's no like firm evidence to go against that, other than the fact that the grabber is also hearing the phone at one point. But I mean, that's about it. But I agree. This feels of a kind with content-wise what Stephen King might write. But the writing is different enough to where I could tell this is not a Stephen King story. Like, it is distinct from him. So that was cool to see. This story in particular came out very early in his career. It first published in 2004, later released in 2007 collection, or 2006, I think, short story collection, 20th Century Ghosts. And I could tell that this is like a fairly early career writer in some ways. It's kind of hard to describe exactly why, other than it's just there's a quality to the prose that feels less polished to me than you typically expect from later career writers. But I noticed there was a quality to the characterization and the content and the ideas that is ultimately more important, I think, than anything else. Is something I'm starting to discern and learn and I don't know. That's just an opinion of mine, I guess. But it's something I'm starting to observe in the industry is that prose can go a long way, and if it's really, really good and really, really tight and really sings in some sort of poetry, that can go a long way. But having a great concept and a great idea that you execute with well-drawn characters will get you, I think, further. You can have fairly pedestrian prose. I'm not saying Joe Hill does, but I think you can have that and still find success if you're nailing the other stuff. So all that is to say that I haven't read a lot of Joe Hill. I'm aware of him, but I haven't read any of his novels or anything like that. I'd be curious to revisit him with some of his later work to be able to compare and contrast because, yeah, like I said, this is a pretty early on story for him. He had his first pro publication in 1997, I saw, so this was 7 or 8 years later. But before he had officially announced that he was Stephen King's son, which that is an interesting part of his history, which we'll talk about. I'm not going to do a summary for the short story because it's pretty similar, as we've already said, to the movie. So we'll do a summary for the movie. But I'll just do like a couple sentences in a minute here when we get to the actual story. But
it's crazy to think that Stephen King may be your proofreader, sort of,
I'm curious to know if he did. I don't know. Yeah, that'd be something I'd want to ask Joe Hill. I don't know if he'd like publicly talk about that or not, but when he was younger and he was writing, was he showing it to his dad? Was his dad giving him notes? Or was his dad too busy, being Stephen King to do that?
I don't know, man. If it was me, I would really want to push back against being Stephen King's son and want to really be my own artist. And I think most artists do want that. And it's wild to me to think that you do have that resource available in the way that he almost could be a continuation of Stephen King in a sense, like a more modern look at some of King's elements, like the things that make King, like, again, that sort of idea of sparse supernatural stuff with like grounded trauma and things like that. That's a very Stephen King sort of premise. And to see, his son continuing in that same vein is, I think at least notable, at least like something that we have to talk about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's similar to if your father was, like the lead singer of the Rolling Stones or something. Was that Mick Jagger? No, is it Mick Jagger?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you like had a rock band, right? Like you would be compared, right? If you went and did something completely different and you weren't a musician, then it might be like more of a footnote. But if you're doing the same kind of thing, like everyone's always going to talk about it. So, whether or not he likes that is the reality. Okay, so his life that from what I'm able to find, that does include some interesting bits. So Joseph Hillstrom King was born in 1972. He is better known by the pen name Joe Hill. He is an American writer born to authors Tabitha King and Stephen King. He was born and grew up in Bangor, Maine. His younger brother Owen King is also a writer, and he has an older sister, Naomi King. At age 9, he appeared in the 1982 film Creepshow, directed by George A. Romero, which co-starred and was written by his father. So if we ever watch that, we'll see a 9-year-old Joe Hill apparently in there.
This is such weird connections. I was just reading about George A. Romero. So Tom Savini is sort of a horror legend, prosthetics and costuming, and then he got into directing, and he worked with George A. Romero a lot and worked on Creepshow. So like he created the mask for this film. So that's our connection all the way through.
Yeah.
All the way through from Creepshow with Tom Savini into Scott Derrickson's version through Joe Hill and then into Stephen King.
Yeah. It's almost like all these people know each other.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So he chose to use an abbreviated form of his middle name for his professional surname, aka pen name, in 1997 when he sold his first pro sale, out of a desire to succeed based solely on his own merits rather than that as the son of one of the world's best-selling and most recognized living novelists. He would go on to first publicly confirm his identity in 2007, the year his first novel was released, after an article in the previous year's Variety reported his identity. So he had to, like, confirm it. But he waited about a year, but there was this article out there, and I'm sure he was getting asked, is it true, is it true, is it true? And he finally confirmed it. Now, this is not something this is maybe apocryphal, but this is a story I've heard a few times at different cons, and it seems to be kind of legendary among literary agents, because I've heard multiple literary agents talk about this. Joe Hill signed with his literary agent and went through the entire process of querying, submitting, and getting his novel sold without revealing to his literary agent that he was the son of Stephen King. So when his literary agent found out, he found out because of this article, and he had to like call him and get it confirmed. And this is just something that literary agents talk about all the time in like incredulity, because it's like, we're doing everything we can to sell your book. And if you are, you know, the son of one of the most popular living authors, please tell me that so that I can, you know, get you as much money as possible. Like, you can see how from an agent's point of view, this is very important information, but you can also see from Joe Hill's point of view that he didn't want to share that. But they laugh about it because, you know, that's the kind of thing where they, you know, at a conference or something, you're talking and it's like, yeah, make sure you share any important information you might have that might help sell your book. As in, you know, and then they give this story.
It was obviously super deliberate, though. Like, he was like, I'm doing it on my own the first time, at least.
Of course.
So,
yeah, he definitely chose to do it, but from the agent's point of view, they weren't happy about it.
Tough job, tough job.
They're like, come on, you tell me that and make my job easy.
Hopefully things came back around, and, you know, if he stayed with that literary agent, they're probably, you know,
yeah, I don't
doing
know.
a lot better.
I mean, I don't know if he's changed agents or not, but yeah, I mean, I'm sure that agent's doing all right. I hope. So his first book was a limited edition collection called 20th Century Ghosts that came out in 2005 that showcases 14 of his short stories and won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Fiction Collection, together with the British Fantasy Award for Best Collection and Best Short Story for Best New Horror. His first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, was published in 2007, so that was the one we were talking about, and reached number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list. Hill is the writer of the comic book series Lock and Key, whose first issue was released in 2008 and sold out of its initial publication run in one day. A collection of the series in limited form from Subterranean Press sold out within 24 hours of being announced.
Just as a comic fan, I've heard amazing things about Lock and Key, and I know it's been adapted as a Netflix show now, but I just remember for years hearing how good Lock and Key was.
Yeah.
As a comic.
Yeah, it's interesting because that came out in 2008, so the cat was out of the bag at that point of his identity. So I could see, like, as soon as people know, you're wondering how much is that driving interest. In Hill's defense, if the writing wasn't good, I don't think the connection to Stephen King alone would be enough to maintain a career. It might create an initial surge of interest, but that will wane if the common knowledge is like, it's not very good. Like, people will stop reading him. So his continued success, you know, give him credit. That's definitely based off the quality of the writing. Hill's second novel, Horns, was published in 2010. A film based on the novel was released in 2014, starring Daniel Radcliffe. Nosferatu, his third novel, was published in April of 2013. The novel peaked at number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. His fourth novel, The Fireman, was released in 2016. It entered the New York Times bestseller list at number 1, making it his highest-ranked novel. In 2018, a collection of 4 short novellas was released titled Strange Weather. Now, this reminded me a little bit of, we've looked at a couple different collections like this from Stephen King. There was 4 Past Midnight that contained The Secret Window novella that we talked about on Why the Book Wins podcast. And there was another. What was the name of the collection that had the body in it?
Yeah, I think it was different seasons.
That's right. So different seasons, 4 Past Midnight. This is something that we've seen King do. I think he has another one too, where he's like combining different novellas into one volume. This may be something that other authors do, but I wasn't aware of it until we saw King do it. So I'm wondering if this is something that he sort of took from his father. You know what I mean? Like, oh, hey, this is something I could do with these collections of novellas. It's kind of a cool idea, and you package it together and sell it as basically a novel. We've definitely seen some success, at least with Stephen King doing it.
I mean, it's nice because you got variety there, right? Like if somebody's like, oh, I don't like this one, I'll go to the next one. It's
in between that and like a collection of short stories, because collections of short stories, unfortunately, typically don't sell super well. Unless the author is, mega famous. But even then, it tends to sell significantly less than a novel would by that same author. And I do think there's a little bit of like, I don't know, I'm curious from your perspective, like why do you think that might be the case? Like why would a collection of short stories not tend to sell as well as a novel?
I'm not sure. I think we've seen with this, especially like modern viewers and readers, really like to get attached to a character and stay around. That's why TV is so massive. And I think that like I really like just a finite film where you get an experience and you leave and they leave you wanting more. So that's something that I like about short stories a lot, is I get that same kind of feeling. But I think it's less approachable for an audience some of the time, especially I would say like the general audience, when they're like putting time into getting invested in these characters and then it ends. I think that can be tough for people. So yeah, that would be my guess. There
is something about that like familiarity and getting to live with something for a while. I think you're right. I haven't heard it really broken down in a way that feels super satisfying to me, but I do think there's something there, right? Like that longevity, that familiarity that can build up the longer you read something. That's why people like really long series, right? Like they feel like they really know these characters. And short fiction, it just doesn't do that. It's a little snapshot. But what's also funny is like in our society, think about like TikTok and like there's so many other forms of entertainment that are so small. And so I always look at short stories and go like, why not short stories? Like, why aren't they more popular? This is a big discussion, and we're not going to solve it here. But like, this is a thing people talk about all the time, because like short fiction in genre and in literature, there's a certain prestige around it. They can get nominated for awards, and it can get you on the map within certain circles. But when you're talking about like reaching broad audiences, short stories typically are not going to do that. It's very unusual, like this one, The Black Phone, to have it be adapted into a major film to where a lot of people are going to all of a sudden become aware of it. But I would still bet you that not a ton of people are running out to read the short story, whereas if this was adapted from a novel by Joe Hill, I guarantee that novel would get a lot of sales. Now, I'm not saying that like his collection's not going to get some sales from this movie. I'm sure it will, but I think by comparison, it's probably, like if you look at like how many copies of Horns sold after that movie came out, it's probably quite a bit more. I don't have hard data in front of me, but that's my suspicion just from what I've seen in the industry.
Yeah, I'm sure. I don't really know, and I do worry that like the younger generations aren't reading as much, and I think we're reading less and less. So maybe that has something to do with it. Like, do you think short fiction did better in past?
I mean, it did do better way back. We're talking like 70s and before, 60s, 50s. Authors like Kurt Vonnegut and Ray Bradbury were able to like create their careers on the strength of their short fiction. And they made good money writing short fiction. Mm-hmm. And you just can't do that anymore. But it has been the case for a while, and it ebbs and flows. Like, I'm not an expert, and I know that there goes different. It goes through different phases. There's this is a big topic, but there's like audio podcasts that do short fiction that have found different levels of success. You look at different podcasts like the No Sleep podcast, or there's all these collections or ongoing podcasts. All the escape artist podcasts, like we were talking about with Rachel K. Jones last week. She's on all of those. Mm-hmm. Those are pretty popular, but it's all relative. Like, what are you comparing the popularity to? So, and the other thing with short fiction is there's an expectation that it's free. Most people do not want to pay to read short fiction. You know, and that's an interesting problem within the genre, because it's really difficult to, you know, have a profitable business if you're giving away the content for free. So this is, again, I'm out of my depth a little bit here because I'm not a publisher of short fiction, but I've gone to many cons and heard publishers of short fiction talk about this stuff. Anyway, let's move on. There's so many different little side roads we could go down talking about this stuff. That's just the first of probably several. So in 2017, Shudder announced that their upcoming series reboot of Creepshow would contain an adaptation of Hill's short story By the Silver Waters of Lake Champlain. Which I included that note because I thought it was pretty cool that at 9 he was in this this Creepshow that his father co-wrote, and then now they're bringing it back in 2017, and his short story is being adapted for the show. Like that has to be a cool full circle moment for him.
For sure. Also, probably part of the reason why it happened a little bit, maybe. You know, I think, like you said,
that's the question, right?
The strength of his writing has continued his success, but it has also been helped along by the fact that he was, you know, involved in all this horror stuff and learned from a young age. I like to think he's like Stephen King's protege, though, you know, rather than him like sort of getting him all of his success.
I don't know, you know, and that's the thing. Like, we don't know what kind of like involvement King actually has. Maybe he's very like, you're on your own, kid. Like I could see it both ways. I don't know.
Yeah, I would love to hear King like sort of speak critically, or not even like saying critical things, but you know, analyze his son's work. And in that way.
I'm sure he never does because
I did hear him say, this is jumping way ahead, but for the film, I heard him say that is like Stand By Me in Hell or something like that.
You know, I could see that a little bit. That's funny. Gosh, the connections to all the things we've covered. Anyway, so yes, and then in 2022, The Black Phone by Scott Derrickson was released, which is an adaptation of Hill's short story of the same name. And I think we're all caught up now on Hill's history as a writer. So the story itself, let's talk about it. 13-year-old Finney is kidnapped by a man called the Grabber. He is trapped in a basement room, and the boy's only hope may lie in a mysterious, disconnected black phone hanging on the basement wall. The phone rings at night with the whispers of the kidnapper's previous victims. All right, that's almost just like a little teaser for the short story. We'll get into more of the summary. But yeah, what were your observations reading this story?
Similar to how... have you seen Prisoners? Denis Villeneuve's film?
I love that movie.
Yeah. So this kind of felt like Prisoners blended with a Stephen King sort of supernatural element that's going to be like doled out over time.
The supernatural element is first off the phone, but then there's also a mention maybe of the sister having a premonition.
Yeah. Shine kind of thing.
Which, very Shining-esque, like a telepathy. But it's not confirmed, right?
No. In
the story, it's a lot more ambiguous.
Yeah, in the movie, I think that they make it pretty clear that there is something else there. Overall, I thought that it's interesting to say fun, but I thought it was a fun story in ways because he's introducing this sort of almost supernatural villain. We're getting that sort of John Wayne Gacy serial killer sort of thing going on.
Absolutely.
And it's all wrapped in like the trauma, I think, as well. You can tell that this Grabber talks a lot about his, like, when he was a kid and things that he remembers, things like that. So
yeah, he doesn't talk a lot about it, but there's a few mentions of it that are, I think, very notable. Yeah.
So I think there's definitely that commentary of like that, what makes a killer, what makes these villains the way that they are.
We've talked about legacies of violence, right, being passed along from parents to child as a theme in King's work, and it is interesting to see a very similar thematic element here. I totally agree that this killer, to me, is evoking John Wayne Gacy and also a bit of Ted Bundy. Not in look. Look is a lot more Gacy, and also there's a mention of him being working as a clown. So I think very directly. But then Ted Bundy's, and he's not the only one who did this, but his tactic for kidnapping people.
He would like act injured and things. He would have crutches and ask for help,
moving something or putting something in his car. A lot of that kind of stuff. Yeah, which is other killers have done, but I think Ted Bundy was maybe perhaps the most famous for it. We saw it later talked about in like Silence of the Lambs. We saw, it being evoked again, where authors have looked at that. And I think this is absolutely what Hill was doing. He was looking at these very famous true crime stories and using them to build this villain.
So this story did feel really familiar to me because of that, but I had to put it in the context of when he wrote it, because I think this like true crime boom that's happened in the last like 5-10 years, there always was sort of, it just wasn't quite as popular, I think.
Well, I think honestly, hey, we're on a podcast. I think podcasting has transformed true crime a little bit because it's such a massive genre within podcasting. And a lot of that came about in like the 2010 and beyond. So before that, when he was writing this, it was probably a little more niche, but it has always been there. As you said, like true crime has always been a fascination for a lot of people. It's just, I think as the accessibility of the information, you don't have to go to a bookstore and buy a book about John Wayne Gacy. All you got to do is like click on an episode of a podcast and listen to it, and you can dip in and dip out, and it's just the internet in general has made it easy.
Right. And that interconnectedness with the hive mind and trying to find killers.
Oh,
and things
yeah.
like that. I think people really get invested in that. Yeah, solving.
Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I think that's all very deliberate, and I think it works. Like we talked about this with The Outsider, how I thought that we thought that was a novel where King was evoking true crime. And that definitely feels like the case here. We get the detail about the black balloons, which makes it into the film. Yeah, I mean it's mostly cool stuff. One thing I will say, if I was going to be a little critical, is that I've heard time and again people talk about Stephen King has a really bad habit of fat shaming and making obese characters either villainous or really self-loathing, like really hate their bodies. In this story, the killer, whose name is Al, is described multiple times as being just like disgustingly obese. And that felt like a very Stephen King detail to me, where like maybe Joe Hill sort of internalized that from reading his father's work without maybe analyzing why that was happening. So it was a little unfortunate for me to see it repeated here. It's not to say, I'm not trying to say you can never have a villainous, fat person, but there can be an equation with obesity and moral fiber being lacking. And I felt like that was a little bit going on here as we repeatedly were describing the way he looked, and then would follow it up with something he was doing that was evil.
And just to jump ahead a little bit to the film, I like the update, right?
Yeah.
Like it's about using a mask. There's something about like being ashamed of like who you are under the mask sort of vibe that's going on in the film, and like revealing parts of yourself that I think like is more effective than what like
that was really interesting.
Yeah.
There is mention of his sister Susanna, who has these like occult beliefs, and she like plays with tarot cards, and she has visions sometimes, and he imagines his sister like on her bike looking for him. And
what a cool sequence too. Like I love the way that it like flowed right into that. He was sort of imagining it, and then I kind of as the reader was going along and was pulled into it as if we were in her point of view at that point.
And he's held for multiple days without food in this basement, and he starts to have these visions tied to the phone, and he starts to hear the phone. But like it's not just that. Like he falls off the bed at one point, and he falls 3 stories. And so there's like weird stuff that starts happening where you start thinking like maybe he's just hallucinating all of this. And that's why I think the story is a lot more ambiguous about whether or not this is really happening. Like
he's also still fucked up from like wasp spray in his face and eyes.
Whatever
and
that. Yeah,
and, like,
wasp poison or whatever it was. Yeah, they played that up a lot more in the story, I think, than the movie. Like in the movie, he's able to see pretty quickly.
Yes.
But in the story, he's like blinded, I think, for like days or like very little vision for a while. Yeah. Now, in the story, my understanding of it was all about this one kid, Bruce, who he had this interaction with on the baseball, playing baseball. and they're both pitchers, but like the other kid was like slightly better than him. They had this like brief overlap and connection, and a lot of that made it into the film, which I was happy to see. But we don't get a lot of the other victims here, and the interaction is fairly brief, and then there is the description of the phone being filled with sand, and then there is a brother who discovers what's going on in the basement, gets hit with a hatchet, I think, in the story, and then he hits Al and beats Al with this phone, and then says, it's for you, as it's ringing, and that's the end of the story. Unclear whether or not the ringing is actually happening or something that is being hallucinated.
Well, and I like that ambiguity in my stories too. Like that adds that nice little element to where we get to debate it if we want to. It's kind of a fruitless effort because it's to each their own. But I do think it's nice to have that within the story because it does allow us to say like, was it not? What was going on in this kid's head? Getting into the mind and the POV of this character.
Yeah. So by the end, I felt like this was a pretty good story. I enjoyed reading it. It's I like the evoking true crime is interesting to me. It's something that I also listen to some true crime podcasts and know about. It had moments that were really interesting. I like sort of the surrealist descriptions, almost dreamlike quality of some of the hallucinations. But the ideas were there and the characterization were there. And it was cool. It was a good story. But I also felt like I don't know why this one was the one that was adapted. And that's something that like trying to figure that out can be maddening for authors because you will read so many stories that feel more
cinematic.
Yeah, or just deserving of adaptation. And whatever reason, this one connected with a Scott Derrickson, and he chose to adapt this one. And that's often the case. There's a myth out there that writing and Hollywood and all of this stuff is somehow a meritocracy. And it's really not. So much of it is just luck and the right person reading the right thing at the right time. It probably didn't hurt that Joe Hill was the son of Stephen King. That may have led into Scott Derrickson wanting to read his collection. I don't know.
I have some good info on that. Yeah, I got some. Yeah. So do you want to wrap up here with the short story? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm good on the short story. Let's talk about the movie. We'll continue to do some comparisons because I think the short story is interesting by comparison to what happens in the movie.
Especially because we've already established that it's very, for the most part, other than the padding that they had to do in order to build out the story, very faithful.
Yeah, very faithful. Al, the villain, is pretty different. They changed him to a magician instead of this like clown character. And I did. That was one of the few things I did read was Derrickson talking about that. Hill and Derrickson had a conversation about it being a clown, and I think Hill was like, "We can't do a clown," because it was right around the time that It had come out in theaters, and they're like, "We got to change, we got to change this." And apparently, it was Hill's idea to change it to a magician, which evokes some of that same weird magic, childhood connection, creepiness that you get from the clown, but isn't so directly. If it had been a clown, it would have been a little too close, I think, for comfort for people.
Yeah. There's so much being done here with like almost Stephen King references that it's like it's there. Like it might as well have been a clown. It was basically Pennywise mixed with like, I don't know, some other Stephen King character.
Although this guy is he's not supernatural. This is a human with human foibles and mental illness.
Going into this, having seen like a trailer, I did kind of think that as we went on, we would learn that like he had been captured or something, or he was supernatural. I thought there may have been that building up, but once the movie started, I kind of readjusted that expectation.
Yeah. It's a little more grounded than that, even though there is that supernatural element.
For sure. And that's what let's get general thoughts out. What did you think about the film overall?
I liked it. I appreciated the unflinching look at childhood trauma and the real dangers that can exist with violence against children. And so this is a topic I wanted to bring up, and I guess I'm kind of getting into it now. In writing, if you're going to try and publish, you have to look at like a lot of different magazines, right? If you're writing short fiction. I would say the majority will say things like, these topics are not going to appear in our magazine. And one of the most common ones you'll see is violence against children. So when you're writing a story like this, you actually are closing yourself off to a lot of potential publication avenues. Now, I totally get why magazines do this. I think it's a multifaceted reason, but for one, they want to be able to say to their readers, you're not going to encounter this in our magazine. So if that's something you don't want to read, it's okay. You can read our magazine. It won't be in there. Mm-hmm. 1. 2, they have to read slush, which slush is the term for all of the submissions they get from anybody on the internet, anybody in the world at this point, right? So the quality of this writing varies dramatically. And if you allow certain material, then you're going to get a lot of that material. And you don't want to submit your volunteer readers to having to read graphic, often poorly executed, sometimes thinly veiled fantasies. Like, there's weird shit you will encounter as a reader that you're like, we can't do this. So you tend to see it almost become more of a thing that, like, you have to earn. Like, you have to earn the trust and confidence of a publication or of a reader to pull off something like this. So I do think there's a place for it in fiction. I'm not like completely against it, but I also totally get why some authors will say, I'll never write a story like that. Because there can be a perception that you are traumatizing the viewer or traumatizing the reader. And because of that potential thing that can happen, some authors would rather just not write about it. As sort of like an ethics decision. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you about it. Do you feel like there's a similar things going on in movies right now? Because I was a little bit surprised by how heavily we were leaning into this guy is kidnapping and murdering children. Now, interestingly, the sexual violence stuff is hinted at, but not like explicitly said. But I think the implication is that it is happening.
Yeah, it's better left that way. It's creepier. It's more ambiguous. You don't know for sure that it's going to happen, but it could happen.
Yeah, well, because like it seems that, I mean, like, what's the motive here? And the likelihood is it's sexually based, right? And that tends to be the case for these killers.
You can tell that he's getting some sort of gratification from the stuff he's doing as well. Yeah, so a lot of stuff to react to with that. Do I think the same thing is happening in film? I think that you've seen children in danger in film maybe a little more.
Well, it's not necessarily children are in danger, but it's like showing actual violence against children. Like, there's this particular scene in this movie with the father whipping basically his daughter that was shocking to me.
Yeah, so to jump ahead and to like get into sort of why Derrickson took this job and why he wanted to tell the story and a lot of things that why maybe that scene was so graphic. Derrickson, this is somewhat in some ways. He says that for the 400 Blows was a big inspiration on him for this film. And what the 400 Blows is, it's Truffaut's film that's semi-autobiographical. And that's sort of the case here as well, which I didn't know about Derrickson, but he's come out and said as much. Derrickson said, quote, "I grew up in a violent household in a violent neighborhood. When I was 8 years old, a friend of mine who lived nearby knocked on my door and told me that his mother had just been murdered. There was also a lot of domestic violence in my home and in the homes of the children I grew up with. It was a scary, violent place to grow up in, and I tried to bring the reality of that to the film." And he goes on to say other things such as, "Most of the children in the film, including the ghosts whom Finney speaks to on the phone, were based on children I grew up with," he says, adding that he spent several years in therapy in order to process his painful childhood memories. So this idea of, I think we've heard King's sort of perspective on this stuff as well. Like, we've seen some of that in his writing. And I think you would know better than me. I think he has said a few times that like he has imbued some of those experiences into his writing.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there is a therapeutic element, I think, to authors putting it in there. I think there's a some writers, I think, feel a obligation or a responsibility, and they take it upon themselves to put their experiences into fiction and to realize that. And I think a lot of people who like horror like that they feel less alone in that their childhood maybe was horrific in some way. And when they see that represented in a book, they can have a connection and they can say, yeah, this is what life can be like. And it can be cathartic. And you can often see, much like this story, a character overcome this challenge and come out the other side stronger. And while I think that can sometimes be a bit of a slippery concept, the idea that like trauma can make us stronger, it can also be aspirational. In the sense of it being aspirational, I like it. And I do think that that is present in the story. I did read that that's one thing that Scott Derrickson said he connected with the story, was that he liked that it felt like a triumphant moment for Finney. And he said it felt cathartic, and that was something he wanted to put into his movie.
That's part of what Derrickson's motivation into the story was. I think he connected with it. He said that he picked up the collection in a bookshop and read through all of the Black Phone, like right there in the bookshop,
Wow.
and realized right away that it could be adapted and would be adapted. It could be adapted well. You know, the idea of this trauma being put on screen too, I think there's something about how unspoken it was for such a long time. Like you think of the 70s and before, like how, you know, child abuse and domestic violence was sort of this unspoken thing. And I think that bringing it to the light, putting it out there for people to see, I think if it even slightly helps someone realize like maybe I shouldn't hit my kids, or, you know, maybe this is not seen as a good thing to do, that can, you know, start a good trend. And that's sort of another angle that I think I would take in terms of like putting something like that into my stories.
Well, not just, I think, unspoken, but commonly just done. Like, right? Like, and still done today. You know, there are still people, you know, there's still a contingent of people who believe in corporal punishment for their children, and whether that looks anything like it does in this movie here, you know, it varies. But I think the inclusion of the father using his belt to beat his kid, I think that's a really important moment for understanding this movie. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when I was reflecting on the film, I realized that our villain is sort of an embodiment and a manifestation of that kind of trauma, but taken to an extreme, which you often see in horror, right? But I think it very telling that his whole little game he plays is about the kid being quote unquote naughty, and he's upstairs with the belt, very specifically, which is what we see the father use. Now, these details are not in the short story, so this is something that Derrickson and screenwriters are bringing to it.
Just to speak about the screenwriter, because you mentioned him, his name is C. Robert Cargill. Derrickson and he work alongside each other a lot. I think they work together on Sinister for sure. I believe the first Doctor Strange as well. So, you know, I think that's a good setup for our general thoughts. I would say that going in, I was expecting maybe a little more supernatural. I was expecting the film to be something that I'd never seen before, because it was my first interaction with the project. And once I realized that we were getting a version of a story I'd seen before and kind of readjusted that, I appreciated it a lot more. And I think it was expertly...
When you say a version of a story you'd seen before, are you referring to the Stephen Kingness of it, or...
No, I was more the Prisoners, sort of like kid being abducted kind of thing. Although Prisoners is more from the perspective of the father who's dealing with an abducted child, not from the perspective of the child. So, you know, maybe it's not fair to say that.
And as much as I did like this movie, I think Prisoners is definitely the superior film. And part of it is the way that it breaks from convention and sort of subverts the expectations of what you think you're going to see in a movie like that. Whereas this movie, I agree, it's a little more like over home plate, like
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
But the once having seen it, having reflected on it, I walked away enjoying it. I think that
Agreed.
I'm a victim of a little bit of hype and a little bit of like I was seeing it debuted at Fantastic Fest like almost a year ago, and I remember people just being like completely blown away and saying it's one of the best horror movies in years. And I think that tends to be the case with some of these like festivals.
Yeah, I'm starting to like after doing this enough with you, and like we hear all this like stuff that comes out of these festivals, and it's like the people at these festivals, people fucking lose their minds, and then whether or not it always bears out. Yeah, not to say this movie wasn't good; it was good. It just is one of the best horror movies of the last decade. I don't know.
Yeah. So horror fans love horror films too. Like, and I find myself in that genre a lot. I consider myself a pretty big horror fan.
Yeah.
And you take the good with the bad. You take an average horror film, and a horror fan feels like it's a lot better. And I am that person. I like an average, and I'm not even saying this is average. I would say this film's above average.
I wouldn't call this an average. I think this is above that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is above average for sure. I think the performances were great. I think the filmmaking was expert, but I think some of the story and some of it just goes back to how closely they adapted a story that was written. So good on them for sort of sticking to that in ways.
There are things that I really like about this movie, and there's a few things that I think just my opinion on storytelling varies a little bit from what I saw. And that is a very subjective point of view. One thing I did really like and appreciated about it is the idea that this is an anti-nostalgia film. That he wanted to, I think he even said, Derrickson, that he wanted to be the anti-Amblin movie.
I saw something where he was saying basically like a lot of people remember the 70s for the nostalgia of it, the fun times, the things that they did, and he remembered like the Manson murders and like things like that like that's things from his childhood that stuck with him.
Well, yeah, 78 is when this movie's set, and that's right around the time that Gacy and all these killers were active and
right. And honestly, when I think back about my childhood, there's like some rose-tinted glasses and stuff, but I also remember things like 9/11 and these big disasters and like the Columbia disaster, and that kind of stuff does stand out to me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important. I think both things can be important in their own way, right? Like it's two different sides of the same coin. Like it's important to remember that not everything is as we wish it were, which a lot of our nostalgia is looking back at something and kind of glorifying and saying, oh, I wish it was this way. And this movie doesn't do that. This movie's showing the dark side of it, for the most part. I do think its ultimate message is a bit rosy.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about Derrickson a little bit. I love him as a filmmaker. I was so excited to see his film Sinister.
So I think I've seen Doctor Strange, and that's it from him. I haven't seen Sinister. I haven't seen...
Have you seen The Exorcism of Emily Rose?
Oh, I did see that one.
Yeah,
okay.
That's what put him on the map. That was his big breakout.
I did like that movie.
Yeah, and then he did The Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu, the remake in 2008.
I did see that.
Yeah, so you've seen his
stuff. That was
stuff.
okay.
But he was, Emily Rose hit really hard. Day the Earth Stood Still, not quite as much. Sinister, I felt like when I saw Sinister, I was like, oh, I want to see him do more horror. I want to see tons of films that this guy makes, because Sinister is one of my favorite horror films of the last,
So would you say better than this movie to you?
I would say so. That's probably a better Derrickson movie, in my opinion. He also did Deliver Us from Evil in 2014, and then, Doctor Strange in 2016. Really strong voice in horror. He teams up with Jason Blum of Blumhouse a lot, and he and Cargill are like sort of writing partners, and I love the stuff that they've created. So anyway, Scott Derrickson is an American filmmaker. I named most of the films that he's directed right there, and most of the notable ones. The film Sinister that I mentioned, it came out in 2012. It was a $3 million film that ended up grossing much, much more than that. It was generally positive critically. And then soon after that, he was sort of picked into to do Doctor Strange, which, you know how that can be, like finding these directors who are like voices like Scott Derrickson, Taika Waititi, these people who are like up and coming.
I feel like Doctor Strange is such a departure from everything you've just described to me. And I think part of that is just that there's like a machine of Marvel, and these directors come in and they still have to like conform to sort of the house style of Marvel, right?
A little bit, but I mean, definitely, no question. But I think that Derrickson was drawn to the project because he liked Doctor Strange a lot, and he was the one who really if you remember Doctor Strange, there's a lot of like psychedelic visuals and stuff, and he started introducing that to Marvel, which I think was really cool. And he wanted to, I don't know if you knew this or not, but Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness that came out recently, he's still listed as an executive producer because he was on to direct it, but he left due to creative differences.
Yeah.
And the creative differences were he wanted it to be way more fucking horror. And there was, if you saw, eventually Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness would go on to be directed by Sam Raimi, who's horror royalty as well.
Yeah.
And crazy to think, like, there are horror elements in that story.
It did feel like that the direction went more comedic, though.
In the way that Marvel wants it to go.
Right.
Sometimes.
Went more Spider-Man for Raimi than it went,
It's interesting, too, because, like, that movie, this is totally tangential, but that movie is so weird in a way that I love because it's so unflinchingly comic booky and at the same time has those horror elements. But I think the problem was that they just didn't blend it correctly to where it felt sort of all the same. It felt like the distinct things were like horror, comedy, and then also sort of like multiverse jumping weird shit. So I don't know. I liked it, but I think that Sam Raimi's great. I think Scott Derrickson's great. I like a lot of the Marvel movies. So
they did Scarlet Witch really dirty in that movie, though. I will say that
to an extent, I would say. I think that it was cool to see her get to be a villain. I do think that it was sort of a step in the wrong direction for her character, just in terms of like her growth over time. Didn't make as much sense, but that's a story for another time. We could do a whole episode about Marvel stuff. So yeah, I talked about how he left the project, and around that time, he and Cargill were like, "What should we do? Like, what have we been working on?" And they started developing this way back before they even started Sinister. They started developing the Black Phone, and they knew they wanted to work on it. Cargill promised to postpone the project until Derrickson, who had a commitment with Marvel Studios, became available to direct. In January of 2020, Derrickson came on board to helm the Black Phone soon after departing the Doctor Strange sequel due to creative differences. Filming took 2 months in Wilmington. The film premiered at Fantastic Fest in September of 2021 and was released theatrically in June of 2022. Mason Thames, who plays Finney, also talked about how because of COVID hitting in 2020, he did his audition over Zoom, and he said it was weird and he had like bad Wi-Fi and they were like delayed, but still he got a call back and the rest is history. But one of the biggest things about the actors coming on board was Ethan Hawke was really hesitant to play a villain. Because I listened to a bunch of behind the scenes stuff before we got on to record, and it's really interesting. Ethan Hawke is quite an interesting figure to listen to speak. I love him as an actor.
Yeah, I agree. He's great.
He was talking about how he never wanted to play villains. He felt that Nicholson was never viewed the same after The Shining. He felt that if you look like pre-Shining and post-Shining, people just didn't trust him as much because he's stuck in their brain as that villain. And I don't agree with that, but I think it's an interesting take for an actor to be sort of superstitious in that way and be like, if I play a villain, they'll see me as a villain forever and they won't trust my performances. And he would go on to say all of these things.
I think there's a kernel of truth for Jack Nicholson, but that doesn't mean it will be true for you.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think he's realized that over time. He just was saying that's sort of how he used to.
Because there are lots. You could give a lot of other examples of actors who have played iconic villains and still have gone on to play iconic heroes, I guess.
Especially when they're like transformative like this. Like Ethan Hawke is like unrecognizable. He's wearing a mask a lot of the time. And that's one of the other things is he was really excited to wear a mask and try to act through that and what it was bringing and what it was giving. Because as we talked about, that mask changes throughout. Shout out Tom Savini on that. Like it was awesome.
I mean, Ethan Hawke is incredible in this movie. I think he's a reason to see it. His performance here is really good. Perhaps the most standout. Although I agree that both of our lead children are very good, and Mason Thames.
I was a little worried in the beginning. Did you have that feeling? The first like 10 minutes, I was like, oh, is the acting gonna be genuine enough and believable enough? And the first little bit, the kids were all interacting a lot, and that can be risky. We've talked about it many times with child actors.
But I realized it was more not the leads; it was some of the the other characters, secondary characters who. I still feel a little mixed about some of the performances. I feel bad calling them out because they are children who are acting and like who knows what they'll go on to become. But yeah, I felt like it was overall a little uneven with a lot of the secondary kids. But our two leads, the actors who played Finney and Gwen, his sister, I think were both really, really good.
Yeah. Mason Thames played Finney, and Madeline McGraw played
Madeline McGraw.
Gwen.
Okay. Yeah, I thought she was really good too. She was one that I was a little worried about early, but actually, the more I saw what they were doing with the character, the more I appreciated it. And then, there's that really harrowing scene. I thought she did an amazing job with. So, and that's a tough thing to ask a kid to portray, and I thought she did a really good job with it.
Yeah. Just to go back to, sorry, I should have mentioned this before, but to go back to Ethan Hawke, apparently he offered Ethan the role. Ethan was hesitant. Then he sent him the script. And then he said less than 24 hours after that, he called me and left a message on my phone speaking in the creepy grabber voice. He read one of the lines from the script before he told me that he would take the role. And then Derrickson goes on to say he brought a deep understanding of the character to the role, and his performance in the film is complex, frightening, moody, and unlike anything he's done before as an actor.
And the voice is, I think, one of the best things he brings to this character, because there is this, he does this like changing, like it shifts from like a higher, almost like lilting voice to this deep, almost demonic, but not in a comical way. Like that almost sounds silly, but he does it in like a way that feels almost natural, but indicative of some sort of psychosis. And I find it really effective. And then, when you're delivering it through this changing mask that looks different all the time. And at first I thought he had multiple masks, and then I realized that it was like the mask is like almost modular. You could like swap out the mouth, and you could swap out the headpiece. Like, so cool. Like, what a great idea. Tom Savini designed mask, like so excellent and so scary. Oh, I did want to shout out Jeremy Davies here. I think he had a very difficult role in The Father. But he's an actor that I do like. He's been in a lot of stuff I've seen. And he
Lost.
Sure. He's in Justified. I think he plays a really interesting character there. And I've seen him in several other things. He's kind of a character actor a little bit. He tends to play this kind of like weird guy who, but that weird guy takes different forms in every movie he's in. And here is this sort of abusive father, pretty harrowing. I see it comes back around a little bit and has a little bit of resolution, but not enough for my liking. Like I wanted something more with the father storyline. I don't know. I'm curious to know if you felt that way or not.
Yeah, I mean, because it felt like it was like there was going to be some sort of reckoning, but it seems like more than anything, he's sorry. At the end of the movie, he's like, he's sorry. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of weak a little bit just in terms of how fucked up what he did was. But I guess, almost losing your child will make you feel like more compassion.
We should probably get into summary now since we're like diving into plot.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it. All right. So in 1978, a serial child abductor named the Grabber prowls the streets of a Denver suburb. Siblings Finney and Gwen Blake live in the area with their abusive alcoholic father. At school, Finney is frequently bullied and harassed. He has a friendship with a classmate, Robin, who fends off the bullies. A boy from another school that Finney knew, Bruce, is abducted by the Grabber. Gwen, who has psychic dreams, much like her late mother, dreams of Bruce's kidnapping and sees that he was taken by a man in a black van with black balloons. Detective Wright and Miller interview Gwen but struggle to believe her claims. The Grabber abducts Robin as well as Finney days later. Finney awakens in a soundproof basement. On the wall is a disconnected black rotary phone that the Grabber says does not work. Later, Finney hears the phone ring and answers it. Bruce's ghost, unable to remember his own name or who he was when he was alive, tells Finney about a floor tile he can remove to dig a tunnel to escape.
The setup here is pretty excellent. I did like the unflinching look at this era. There's a sort of film grain that I noticed that was evoking that 70s vibe. It's good stuff, interesting stuff. There's this detail of this little rocket that he uses to slash the Grabber, which is kind of something from the story, although it's not necessarily a rocket. I think he bites him in the story, but that injuring him was a thing. All creepy. And then seeing this basement, like actually made into a set and how frightening it is, how sparse, and the shadows of it, I think, are used to great effect as we start to see that evoked with the supernatural elements. very cool. And then we hear about this tile that can be lifted up, and there's a couple different things he's able to discover in the space that he's able to use in different ways.
Yeah, I like, and to jump to the end, I like that, like, all of these little things that he keeps learning, like, eventually are important to get out. Like, I thought it was a cool build up for that. You mentioned the shadows, and in that way, you mentioned lighting, and I thought it was really good use of lighting, like this sort of like light coming through these small windows, light from like maybe a lamp or something like that. There was one time where he says like, if there's somebody out there, I'm going to scratch your face so that when they see you, they know that like something happened. They're going to ask about it. And he's like, what, this face? And he like sort of leans back and reveals the mask into like this pool of light. And I thought it was such a cool shot.
Yeah.
I think it probably made the trailer too, if I remember correctly.
Oh, really?
They did a good job of making the space feel sort of weirdly large and small at different times to kind of put you on your back foot, I think. Good use of space. I mean, a lot of the film, it's tough to be like, oh, we're gonna put you in a basement, a dreary, dark, shitty basement, and then film an entire movie down there. But they did a good job of making the space feel believable and weird. And
I think in one of those initial calls he gets to, there's this moment where the bottle spins. This glass bottle spins on the ground and then points up at the window, and I felt like that was all done practically. Was what it seemed like to me, and it looked really cool. I don't know, those little ways that he evoked the supernatural were pretty neat. And I would always worry that something like this could come off kind of hokey, but I felt like he walked a really good line of not making it come off that way. And then there is a blending of the story being revealed through the phone and sort of the dreams that his sister's having about the crimes. And so there's like a connection that's formed there within the movie that works really well.
Visually, I also liked that Derrickson loves like film stock. There's like a few moments where we're seeing flashbacks or we're seeing like different. I feel like even the dream was maybe not on film stock. Definitely the beginning. There's sort of a montage sequence at the beginning, but it's also evoking that time period. Super 8 sort of home video film, like stock film being shot, and wealthier families having stuff like that to film their home videos, and that way that it brings back the nostalgia in a way, and it reflects it in the film, I think is really cool. Gwen's powers, we've talked about it a little bit. It's definitely got quite a bit of shine to it. And expanding this stuff isn't easy. Like when you think about adapting a story that's sort of sparse in comparison to a feature-length film, trying to figure out what still is in the same vein as what was being told. I think that was sort of within the story a little bit, but to flesh it out this far and then to say like the mother also had it was such a shine sort of thing.
Inherited.
Inherited kind of thing.
Yeah, and although it seems like it kind of drove her mad and she committed suicide over it. So and the father's worried about her suffering in the same way.
A couple other like Stephen King sort of references in ways that I read online and sort of noticed on my own as well. Gwen, when she's like riding on her bike with the rain and everything, is wearing like the yellow jacket.
I thought about that too. I was like, this is
it looks very much like a Georgie from It,
which makes you concerned for her
in that same like film language sort of way. Where like, where have I seen this before? Didn't that not end well?
Yeah, I wish we had more scenes of the grabber, Ethan Hawke's character, interacting with his brother. That was one thing that I wanted, even just one scene, because I don't think we ever see the two talk other than at the end of the movie when he gets the axe. I would have liked to see that. What are their relationships like? Now, I understand that's kind of mysterious by not showing it, but
I think that's part of it.
Man, I don't know. Like, I liked Ethan Hawke so much in this role. I would love to see what that looks like when he's talking to his brother.
I heard Derrickson talk, and he basically said like some of his favorite villains in film you know nothing about, and I think that's part of it, is just keeping that mystery and keeping it's very unsettling. Why, like, how has this guy not realized that there's something going on in this room? And pretty wild. All right, moving on to the second part. The police search for Finney is unsuccessful. The grabber brings Finney food and leaves the door to the basement unlocked. Finney prepares to sneak out, but is stopped by another boy on the phone called Billy. He explained this is a game that the grabber plays, and he is waiting upstairs to attack Finney with a belt if he leaves the basement. Billy instructs him to use a cord he found to get out via the basement window. While climbing, Finney breaks the bars on the window, preventing him from climbing back up. Gwen dreams of Billy being abducted and confides in her father about what is happening. Wright and Miller speak to an eccentric man called Max who is staying in the area with his brother. It is revealed Finney is being held in Max's basement, of which he is unaware, and the grabber is his brother. After an agitated exchange with the grabber where he tests Finney's honesty, he makes it seem as if he would let Finney go. Finney speaks to another one of the victims, Griffin, on the phone. Griffin shows Finney a combination to a lock and informs him that the grabber has fallen asleep upstairs. Finney sneaks upstairs and unlocks the door, but the grabber's dog alerts him to Finney's escape. Finney flees down the street but is recaptured.
Excellent sequence. I thought the building suspense and him sleeping on the chair, it's very menacing. You kind of knew like, oh, he's gonna get discovered. This is too early in the movie for him to get away.
Right.
But you know, it was an exciting moment and definitely frightening. You know, it's like that thrill, right? Of like he knows the danger. He's been warned of what's happening up there, and yet he has to face it. So it's part of this growth, I think, that we see out of Finney as he's learning to be brave, right, and stand up for himself, which is kind of the message that that other character, I think Robin, tells him.
I find it cool that he like tries to use the rug to get out with the cord and everything as well.
Yeah, I like to see him using his head, right?
Right, which is, you know, I think there's another version of this where like the cop comes and saves the day and the kid's just been cowering the whole time. So it's fun to see this story playing out like that.
He's saving himself, which I do like the idea of that, right? Like he's not just a victim who needs to be rescued. He is his own savior, ultimately.
Yeah. And you're right, that scene with the lock is there's so much tension there as he's like creeping by. Like when you're in a movie, it's like a very specific kind of tension that you can build in that way, and it definitely got the job done there.
There's a couple of really good jump scares in this movie too. You know, for what they're worth, you know, like I have mixed feelings about jump scares, but you know, they could be fun every now and then, especially if they're combined with something truly creepy. And I felt like there's this one in particular that stands out to me that got me pretty good, where he hears this dripping sound. And he's like, what is the sound? He's like looking around the basement. I kept like thinking like, is there like a drip? Is there dripping water somewhere? Is the faucet dripping? And then he looks over in the corner and there's this body of this kid he's like dangling with, you know, like in this really unnatural way. And like his throat has been slit and is dripping blood on the ground. And that's the dripping he's been hearing. And it's something about the sound, I think, like gets loud when we see that image, and it definitely startled the shit out of me. But a very cool visual, a very scary one. And then you know, that's followed up with another moment later with this other kid who is himself kind of a bully, but also a victim, right? Obviously, older kid, it seems like. And there's a moment where he's like yelling at him, and then he gets yanked. And I think it's you know, like it seems like one of these moments that is in a lot of movies where they put you on a harness and they literally pull you back like as fast as they can, and you fly back and land on a pad usually. But he takes that and then makes him, through a manipulation with computer graphics, I imagine, look like he gets pulled just like into the fucking darkness and off into like the ether. Yeah. And that moment looks really cool. Like I was like, that's just a cool fucking sequence.
I like a lot of what they did visually with the people on the phone sort of appearing. Like the camera would sort of go around the subject, and then while he's on the phone, the person on the other end would like appear and then like sort of disappear like based on when he was talking to them and stuff. And I thought that a lot of it looked really cool in the way, even like we'll get to that in a second, but when Robin is like teaching him to fight, like they're both like very choreographed together. Like I found it to be kind of cool.
I thought it was okay. I don't know. Robin in general, I felt like was one of the weaker parts of the movie. I felt like it was maybe a little too cute to have this like super badass kid who's taken him under his wing and is willing to teach him all the lessons and how to fight for himself and literally choreographing the fighting that he would then later use. I don't know. Is there something wrong with me for like seeing this as almost a little corny?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I get it. I took it to be like more genuine and I liked it because there's I think like that's the point of the story, is like learning to fight for himself, and this guy is kind of there to help him. But definitely, like, it feels very like it's almost like a Disney moment or something. Otherwise,
Yeah,
weird movie.
it felt almost out of place in this otherwise really dark movie to have this almost like cute moment. Anyway, let's read the final bit here.
So, despondent over his failed escape attempt, Finney answers the phone to hear another victim, a punk called Vance, whom Finney was scared of. Vance informs Finney of a connecting storage room he can escape through if he breaks a hole in the wall and exits through the freezer to the other side of the wall. Finney creates a hole with the toilet tank cover and enters the back of the freezer, only to discover that the freezer door is locked. The phone rings one more time with Robin at the end of the line. He comforts Finney and encourages him to finally stand up for himself. He instructs Finney to remove the phone receiver and pack it with the dirt he had dug out to use it as a weapon. Gwen dreams of Vance's abduction and discovers the property of the grabber. She finds the house and contacts Wright and Miller. Max realizes Finney is being held in the house and rushes to the basement to free him, but his brother kills him with an axe. The police rush to the house Gwen found but find it abandoned. In the basement, they find the buried bodies of the grabber's victims. The grabber attacks Finney with the axe, but Finney manages to trip the grabber with the cord, causing him to fall into the tunnel Finney dug, where the grabber breaks and traps his ankle in the window bars placed at the bottom. The ghosts taunt the grabber over the phone before Finney breaks his neck with the phone cord, killing him. Finney distracts the guard dog with meat from the freezer and escapes the house using the combination he learned. Finney exits the house across the street from the gravesite, where he reunites with Gwen and the police rush to the property. The siblings comfort each other as their father arrives and apologizes for his treatment. Back at school, a confident Finney sits next to his crush in class.
I liked the detail that Hawke included of like when the mask gets knocked off, he sort of loses some of his power as he's sort of like being seen for the first time. And he like that I think is something that this character is afraid of.
Facing himself.
Yeah, or just being seen in general. Like he's keeping all of that secret and hidden. He does, he talks about his experience in this basement and with this phone. And I think you're right that there is some implication that maybe something happened to him down here.
Well, he said it hasn't worked since he was a kid. The phone
yeah, I don't know. Like the history of violence kind of stuff, some implications of that. But, they don't explore it because I think he doesn't want us to empathize too much with the killer, which is probably a good decision. And unfortunately, often you look at serial killers, they're not always, but there does tend to be childhood abuse that they suffered that then seems to have some effect on them as adults.
Yeah, head trauma a lot too.
Yeah, head trauma is pretty frequent. That's true. I also thought that it was really interesting that there was this like basement connection with this freezer, and I was so confused about like where and how this worked.
Yeah.
And are the basements connected? Like, where is this freezer? I couldn't figure. Are there two basements? Like, I don't know. There are definitely two basements, but are there two basements within the home, the home that he's being held in?
I think so.
I guess so. That seems pretty unusual to have like.
And then he would bury the bodies at the neighbor's house or whatever, or the other house that they owned. I guess
Because I thought they connected somehow, but that I guess doesn't make sense because it would have to go like under the street, so that's not happening.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the freezer was just in like a separate basement within the same home.
Of the same house, yeah.
Strange. So fast forwarding a little bit to the end here, the message of the movie is definitely one that like I like, right? Like you can overcome your trauma, you can find a strength in it, and you can best it yourself, not needing to be rescued. His connection with his family over it, like it seems like the bond with his sister becomes very important. I like that. They share this sort of abusive home. But again, the father comes and is sort of begging forgiveness of them at the end. And I guess that's the full circle moment for the father, but it almost didn't feel like enough, but maybe that's okay.
It feels like what you do, like a desperate thing, and then I kind of feel like he's fallen back into his ways in a few months to a year.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, is he never going to do it again, or are we getting this again? Because I feel like we're getting it again. I don't know that he's really
and maybe that's the sad side of it. Like maybe that was Derrickson's viewpoint on it, is that kids can't escape it until they leave the home or something in some cases.
So the other thing, I ultimately wanted this movie to end there. The scene that I was not as much of a fan of was this final going to school moment.
It feels a lot like it's like that happy horror film of the early 2000s vibe, where there needs to be some wrapping up, some feeling good moment.
Yeah. It's a step too far, and I get that that's really driving the message home that he wants to drive home, of like being empowered and the cathartic experience. But unfortunately, I don't think it really holds true for real life abuse, right? And people who've gone through something horrific like this, they're not really viewed as like rock stars, and they're not walking into school now the confident badass who's going to go get the girl, and everybody's like, oh my god, he's amazing. And that's the vibe of this final scene, and I don't like it because I think, unfortunately, when someone goes through something horrific like this and people know about it, instead it becomes a bad, like, people are afraid to talk to you. They don't know what to say. They kind of subconsciously view you as damaged in a way, and I think people are afraid of that, and they don't want to bring back some of that trauma by saying the wrong things. I think people are like afraid to talk to you, but then also like subconsciously, I think people worry that there's like that they could get some of that on them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to say it in a way. It's like it's not a conscious thing, but I don't think that people are looking at you because you killed somebody. Like, he killed somebody, okay? I don't think people are looking at him and saying, "Wow, what a badass." I think people are going to be like, I can't believe this kid went through this shit and he killed somebody. Like, yeah, the guy was a murderer himself, but I don't know. I just don't think his reputation would be that of as a fucking rock star at the end of when he goes back to school.
I mean, yeah, I can see it. It feels a lot like a lot of horror films, for whatever reason, felt the need to end like this, to make people feel badass, to make people think it's badass. I mean, like,
maybe it's the true crime in me too, a little bit. Like, I've heard enough about victims who escape and shit like that. Like, their lives are forever changed by what they've gone through, and they often have to have therapy for many, many years after, and whether or not they're able to ever come to grips with what they suffered.
I guess my only 2 points on it would be, one, it's like therapeutic again, like he's sort of going through the motions and feeling everything he went through, and this
is almost like a parable in some ways, right?
Or like a wish fulfillment of like what he would have preferred to happen in his life or something like that, based on like things that have happened. And then also, teenagers love to go see horror films, and I don't know, is this R? I don't even know if it's R.
I think it is.
Inevitably teenagers are going to see it, and like maybe that's like for them, that like an idea and that empowerment.
There is something to be said for that. But okay, so the father, I think his apology lands better and is given more importance if it is the end of the movie. But it gets overlooked, I think, because we are given this other scene that's the thing that you're going to leave the theater thinking about. And the thing we leave the theater thinking about is this final moment of him returning to school. I just would have I would have ended on the father begging forgiveness, I think, is a better place to end it. And we don't know. There is a little bit of like a Bruce Willis-y like confidence that he is even walking out of the house with, that I thought was a little odd. Like the police run up to him and he goes, basement. And I thought it was like, I was like laughing. I was like, it's like such a badass as he's walking out of there, and he's like, yeah, go in the basement. You'll see. Damn, dude. But still, regardless, I still think that's a better place to end on, for me, than this very, very wish fulfillment-y moment at the end that we get. kind of a weird gripe, but it is the thing that you leave with. It's the final thing in the movie, so it's got a lot of importance, right? Is that primacy and recency stuff, right? Like we're gonna leave remembering the thing we saw last, and that's the thing we see last.
Right. I think that leads us into our vote here. We have to decide if we preferred the source material from Joe Hill, The Black Phone, or if we preferred Derrickson's film. So you want to start?
Sure. I really enjoyed this movie, ultimately, as much as I have my quibbles and the things that I've sort of harped on. It's funny because like we're doing an episode where we're dissecting a thing, right? So we're going to talk about our criticisms, but like I talked about how much I loved Ethan Hawke in this movie. I think it is scary. I think there's some really clever visuals. Ultimately, I like this adaptation a lot. Short story was pretty good. Nothing about it to me screams this deserves to be made into a movie, if that even means anything. So solid. I do want to read more Joe Hill because I feel like this is just barely scratching the surface of what his writing can be like. So I'm interested to do that. I guess ultimately I come down on it. I think I prefer the movie. I'm going to give it to the movie here. I think it takes a story that has some good bones, has some good ideas, and there's an evolution. There is an expansion, and I think that worked better for me, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything that was done. I'm going to give it to the movie here.
Yeah, I really want to read some more Joe Hill as well. I think I've been wanting to read Joe Hill for a long time. We've talked about Lock and Key. We talked about
Horns.
I would like to revisit him for sure. I enjoyed the story. I think it's got good bones, like you said. This idea of true crime mixed with, and like this child fighting for his life in this way and dealing with the trauma and in some similar ways, in interesting ways, to now be able to look at Joe Hill and Stephen King and sort of find his place in horror in this way. And I think it's clear that he is his own artist. So that's cool. I think I'd like to see what else he has in his repertoire. This film, I just like Derrickson a lot as a filmmaker. I like his vision. I like the way that he approaches horror films. I'm, mostly positive on this film. Glad that it exists. Want to see more from Derrickson again. I think, like I said before, my expectations did play with me a little bit because I was really looking for Sinister, and it's something a little different this time. I'm gonna take the film here. I liked it enough to where I would recommend it to people, which is a big factor for me. So if you like horror films, and it's sort of this, in the way that it doesn't want to be nostalgic, it's still sort of an homage in certain ways, and it does have some things that horror fans are definitely going to enjoy. And I think like it's we talked about how maybe it's a little right over home plate, but then I think he hits pretty much a home run. Like although it may be easy to criticize some of the things that we've seen before, he did a lot of good with it. And I like I said before, I loved a lot of the visuals, and it takes place mostly in a basement, and Ethan Hawke's performance is just like next level.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds like we're both giving it to the movie here. Stick around for the very end of the episode where we're going to announce our next project, which I'm very excited about. But if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on, especially on Apple Podcasts. We are getting so close to 100 reviews. I'd love to see that. It would just be an exciting sort of, milestone for our podcast.
And make sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. We are also on TikTok now, so check that out.
That's true. If you would like to support this podcast monetarily, we do have a Patreon, and on there you can get different merch that is exclusive to Patreon. And also at our $2 tier, you can get our bonus episodes, which are released monthly. We're going to be recording another one of those soon. I don't even know what it's going to be, but it'll be on there soon. Definitely check that out. Lots of good content.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, so all that's left to do is to announce our next project, which definitely excited for.
Yeah, it's Sandman, Neil Gaiman, which I've been looking forward to for literally years at this point, since it was announced that it would be adapted.
One of our favorites on the pod, right?
I've always wanted to read this. Yeah, love Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, and this is one of the ones that's like, I think what is maybe his most well-known, at least among Gaiman fans, especially if you're someone who knows him from his comic book work. Like, this is the touchstone. Everybody talks about Sandman. I've never read it. So we're going to cover the comic first before the show comes out. I think the first half of the initial run, which is like I think the first 10 issues, something like that.
Yep.
So our plan is to tackle that, talk about the comic, then we'll dive into the show, leaving the second half of it so that we can preserve some of the story. We'll react to the first half of the Netflix series, which I think is all dropping at once, and then we'll come back and do a third episode. So this is going to be a three-parter where we wrap up the show and comics at the same time and make our judgment on what is the one we prefer ultimately. So, big project coming up. Hopefully you join us again for that in the future. And until next time,
keep adapting.